morning and welcome to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. On today's show, we're honored to be chatting with social entrepreneur Connie Duckworth, one of the founders, the CEO, and chairman of ARZU. ARZU is a social enterprise based off the East Coast that works with women in rural Afghanistan as weavers and creates sort of this learning laboratory for women to create job skills. And Kelly, this is going to be a fun show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jen. I'm so excited to talk to Connie and really learn about how she got started down this path.
Yeah, and the thing about Connie's story too, Kelly, is that she's come from a traditional commercial sort of good old boys network, and I don't mean that negatively, but the good old boys network in finance and oil and gas and things like that. And has really shifted over the years into this social enterprise and this idea of being a conscious capitalist. And notice that I didn't say nonprofit. It's not necessarily about being a nonprofit. It's about being a socially conscious capitalist.
And what Connie has said in the past, and what I'm excited to learn about, is that if you have these successful business platforms in your own career, you can leverage that to make a difference in the world.
Absolutely. Well, as I said, Connie Duckworth is the chairman and CEO of ARZU, and welcome to the show, Connie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Connie, can you tell us a little bit about the organization and what you're doing there at ARZU?
ARZU is, as you said, legally structured as a nonprofit 501c3. And in Afghanistan, we are a registered local Afghan NGO. And I think that's an important distinction. But in reality, we operate like a business, and that has been our MO since day one. The idea was really to try to create a new model using social entrepreneurship to find a commercially saleable, competitive product and have the sales proceeds from that fund all of the charitable social programs. We call that the back end. And in effect, a closed loop set of funding. Because unlike a regular charity, our goal is never to fundraise. People can write us checks because we're a 501c3, but we don't have a development person. We don't do solicitations, although there are years when I wish we could, or did.
Yes.
So, can you give a little bit of background? How did you start this? What happened to start you thinking down this path?
Well, women's issues and women's rights has always been my own personal soapbox, ever since I was probably in junior high or high school, when we're all very young and idealistic. And in many ways, my own career mirrors the entrance of women into the professional workplace, because I was an earlier MBA student. I was hired in the oil and gas business, really I think on an EEO program more than anything else. And then I entered Wall Street, and so for my whole career, I retired at the end of 2001 from my career on Wall Street. I was often the only one in the room, and so I really felt a responsibility to the younger women who were coming behind me to try to make their path a little easier than those early birds had been. And so my whole personal soapbox has been women's rights. So when I retired, I knew I wanted to do something related to women's rights, and then fate sort of intervened.
So what prompted the idea of ARZU Studio Hope and going to Afghanistan? Why Afghanistan?
Well, I had been tracking the Taliban abuse of women just in general in the newspaper, and right as I retired, I got a call from a friend of mine in Washington who said, "I put your name in for something, so you might get a call." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Well, the State Department is forming a bipartisan commission to help Afghan women have a seat at the table." This was right after the fall of the Taliban, the end of 2001. And she said, "Oh, call Connie Duckworth. She just retired. She's really into these women's things, and she's got a lot of time." So that's what took me to Afghanistan.
And what prompted the ARZU Studio Hope? What prompted ARZU?
Well, I was technically the business representative of what was this very small delegation. There was someone from philanthropy and education, healthcare, and so forth. And so we all were supposed to, on our first trip in January 2003, to Kabul, Afghanistan, when it was still considered a war zone. We were the first delegation of any Americans that had been allowed to overnight in the country. And seeing what I saw on the ground and the conditions of women. I live in Chicago. This was January. Think Denver, think Chicago. It was freezing. And the last spot we visited before we got on the military plane to fly out was this bombed out, ugly Soviet-style building, no windows, jaggedy stairs, and there were dozens of widows and small children wearing flip-flops living in this building. And I came away saying, okay, my something is going to be figuring out a way to create jobs, because when a woman can earn an income and support her family, she can have control of her life.
Yes, and so I just can't imagine what you must have felt in your gut to see that, because I'm with you. I'm very, very pro-women. We need to help each other move forward, and that would kill me. That would just, I would have left thinking, I would have left the same way you were, like, this is good, this is going to get fixed. And so how did you, so having entered the Old Boys Network, now you're part of the sort of leading women's network that started this whole movement. So how are you leveraging that to help these women in Afghanistan? And how did you use your experience?
Well, I think, first of all, business experience is probably one of the absolute single best trainings that you can have to help in any kind of intervention. I believe that the discipline of the private sector, understanding how to follow the money, is critical, because if you follow the money trails, it will explain for you exactly what behavior is going on and why. And so, so that was one of the lessons that I brought with me. So while I did not know anything about Afghanistan, I did not know anything about traditional international development practices, which was a good thing, and because I used a lot of common sense instead of relying on traditional practices. Right. And I really didn't know anything about rugs, because that was a default product, because there simply wasn't anything else after we did our research.
So talk about that a little bit. You have a couple product lines at ARZU. Talk about the product lines and what was the thinking behind that?
Well, I was really product agnostic. My goal was to create jobs now. And this would have been in early 2004 for women now. And so I looked at the apparel industry, which is often an early entrant into low-cost labor markets. And I called a few, leveraging networks, critical, friends who were CEOs of different manufacturing companies. And I said, would you consider putting a small light manufacturing facility in Kabul, Afghanistan? And there'd be a pause, and they'd say, well, do they have electricity there? No. And isn't there like a war going on there? Well, yeah. And they're landlocked. How do they ship out of there? Well, interestingly, 10 years later, they still don't have commercial shipping in Afghanistan. So there were all these barriers. So I thought, ooh, that's a blind alley. So I kept trying and considering different kinds of industries, and we literally backed into rugs. Traditional, high-level skill, literally unlimited number of destitute but skilled Afghan weavers, culturally acceptable because they'd been doing it in their homes for centuries. And even at the height of the Taliban, there had been some rug activity going on. Quality was poor, supply chains were disrupted, sheep were skinny, And so there was a lot of work to try to get it on even keel. Right. But literally, that's why we chose it, the only game in town.
Huh. So when you started it, were you in Kabul? I mean, did you start it in Kabul in that active war zone, or or how did that, I mean, how do you choose what city? I mean, here you are playing in a country that's seen as one of the most dangerous places on the planet, and every road is very expensive, if you will, from both a human toll as well as a energy toll to even move in those countries. How did you figure that part out? And because I know you're in different provinces now, but when you got started, how come Kabul?
Well, we started in Kabul simply because it's the capital and that's where the airport is and so forth. And I didn't know any better. So we started in kind of a slummy, displaced persons area with 30 weavers. And as soon as we got our feet on the ground and started to figure out how things worked, we left town. We went out into one of the most remote, destitute provinces. And while logistically it's harder to operate, in many other ways it was so much easier. We aren't dealing with corruption. We're dealing with people who are incredibly hardworking, are so interested in carving out a better life for their families. And importantly, it's the only excuse me, the only province in Afghanistan that has a woman governor.
And what's it called?
It's called Bamiyan Province, and you will know it because of those big Bamiyan giant Buddhas that the Taliban blew up just months before they fell. A real tragedy. But we work within line of sight of the remaining Buddha niches. And I met on my first trip Habiba Sarabi, who was at that time the first women's minister. She then, year 2, was appointed the first woman governor in Afghanistan, and she asked me on my second visit the following year if I would please bring the ARZU project to her province. And wanting to support woman governor when the guys are constantly trying to knock her off, we went there. And so we've had this tremendous local support from local officials as well as local residents, and that's made all the difference.
I love that.
Yeah, and that's critical, right? You went in, and it sounds like you went to both. You saw the problem. You identified who are the key local officials, and that's a critical piece, and an amazing roadblock if you don't have that support. So, how did you actually start to garner that local support?
The local support, to your point, is absolutely critical, and I think this is one of the failings in general of big top-down international development practices. Again, I didn't know anything about them, so I didn't realize it until I was in. But when policies are and programs are being developed from a distance by people of different cultural values and then imposed, it doesn't work. And there are so many cases around the world of that. Mm-hmm. I really believe, and this is one of the learnings that I have really come to understand, that you have to start at seeding the lowest common denominator, at the local, most poor level, and let things take root and grow up, because ownership by the local people is critical for success.
Sure, sure.
So how many times when you were looking at, okay, what is our product going to be, and then starting to get the local approval, how many times did you say, oh, this is just not going to work, and how did you overcome that?
Well, we've been producing now on the ground for 8 years, and just about every year there's been some seemingly insurmountable big problem or big question that had to get resolved or game over. And in the first year it was, can we ever find a product that can be made in Afghanistan and employ women?
Sure.
Then it was, can we ever find a couple of key local staff that can be the seed of our local staff, because we are a local organization. And how do you find somebody that's honest, that you can rely on, that you can trust in a virtual company? Mm-hmm. So then we overcame that. Then it was suddenly about year 3, oh my gosh, we're working in a distributed manufacturing setting, meaning hundreds of houses. How can we ever get the product quality up to international standards? Because charity product doesn't sell. We needed to be competitive. Well, so it took probably 4 to 5 years to build that footprint. And we've consolidated. We had been farther flung, but we realized that logistics in Afghanistan are a huge issue.
Brutal.
So we decided to consolidate all of our efforts in Bamyan province, and that let us keep expenses down
Yeah.
and get better and go better, deeper and broader. So did I ever want to quit? Probably just about every year. But then something would intervene. We call those ARZU moments internally in our staff.
I love that.
And it's when something happens that's exactly what we needed just at that moment.
Well, and I want to go on that a little bit more. I mean, we've talked about some of the cultural barriers and some of the barriers to just getting started. I mean, growing social enterprises is not easy, but there's also, I would imagine, in this economy that this was a really tough undertaking, and that it's not just about the financials, but that there's all kinds of other barriers that go along with creating your own organization and working in very remote places that are very almost closed off from the rest of the modern world. Can you talk about some of those barriers a little bit and some of those learnings that you've experienced?
Let me talk first about the people side of that question, and then I'll talk about the product side. The people side, this decision, and again, this was a decision I made just as a gut instinct, not because I knew any better. I wanted to go with an all local staff from day one. And we were about the only people, in fact, one of our applicants for country director said it was the first time she had seen a specific job description wanting an Afghan as the head person. And that's a whole nother set of issues for Afghanistan. But that caused us to be sort of the tortoise versus the hare, because gradually we built our team, and we now have 52 people, all Afghans, doing every aspect from management all the way down to master gardener in our women's co-op garden, to the lady that runs the laundromat. All of these people are local people. They come from the local community. I would say less than a handful speak English at all. And so that's another challenge, because we had to have a couple of people that could communicate with us. And they speak much better English today than they did when we started 8 years ago. But it really was going local. Now, that decision has proved to benefit us. It's paid dividends we had never anticipated. For one thing, we've never had what they call euphemistically security. That means guys with guns. We are not an organization that's ever had security, and it's really expensive to do that.
Yeah.
We're not in the green zone. We aren't ever locked down in the green zone like most organizations, because it's gotten so dangerous, because we were never there to begin with. So our group just keeps growing and developing, and we are now executing our most ambitious both social and product projects as the country has gotten more dangerous, because we just operate like locals. We are locals. So that's been a huge help. Now, on the product side, one of the early learnings we had is that if our target client base are basically socially responsible corporations, and I assure you, any company I've ever been in has area rugs somewhere.
Right.
And socially, I'd call it conscious consumers. People who, if they're going to put something in their home, they want something that has some meaning. And I think this is a trend that is only going to accelerate in the United States. Well, if that's your market, and your producers are women who probably couldn't point to the U.S. on a map, because when we started 100% illiterate, you can't expect them to have any idea what is going to appeal to this market. So one of the differences is we started with design and what the market was, what was saleable in the market, and we backwardated to that's what we produce. So this linkage, very consciously, of design, Western tastes with traditional processes has been, I think, one of the reasons that we've been successful.
Yeah, that is amazing. So, and then I just want to touch on something that you said really quick, because Jan and I also do an Energy 101 segment on this show. And so at the beginning you said, okay, so they don't have power. Do they have power now? I mean, it sounds like if they have a laundromat, they have some sort of access to power.
We're off the grid. There's still basically no countrywide power grid. A lot of generators, a lot of diesel generators, small, things powered. But where we work, no. So one of our rules of thumb for any project we do is nothing can plug in. And so we search the internet, and we have wonderful, anytime we can co-opt a wonderful engineer who has experience with low tech. It's kind of back to the future.
Yeah.
University of New Mexico, we found on their website a food dehydrator that it looks kind of like a slide with glass, and air comes up, gets warmed by the sun, filters up through these boxes. We dehydrate hundreds of pounds of vegetables that year each year in our garden. So it's all low tech. Our laundromat, and there's always a little bit of a translation issue. I said, well, how's the water going to be warm? Because the alternative is literally chipping through the ice and having women wash their dishes in freezing water, which is painful to watch. Yeah. No, we have sun boilers. And I'm like, are those solar paneled? What do you mean sun boiler? They're literally tanks, gravity fed, sit on the top of our laundromat, and over time the water warms up. And then it comes down and the women wash their clothes in, I'd call it warm, not piping hot, but warm water in cement tubs. And we've built this whole facility around these sun boilers. It's low tech.
Yeah, that is interesting. So we'll have to put you in touch with some other energy companies that may be able to help with those things too, that are also low expense but also high efficiency. That could maybe be really helpful. It
would be phenomenal. Yeah. We're always on the lookout for new approaches we can test, and that's why, what started as a rug project in my own mind, and I have to say, quite honestly, I had no idea what I was getting myself into and how long it would take. And one piece of advice I'd say is that just like starting any business, if you want to start a social business, you're looking 7 days a week, 24/7. You're in the shower, you're thinking about it, and it's just what it is.
Yeah.
But it's worth it.
Well, and I want to follow up with that. What advice would you give? I mean, a lot of people that listen to our show, a lot of the demographic are their own business owners, and trying to figure out, can the business shift to more of a social enterprise, or could they become better conscious consumers, if you will? What advice would you give them about organizing their business this way, or thinking about these things as they go forward?
The first piece of think and plan and ponder, yes. But we actually never take that first step. And I say just jump in the pool, and then it'll sort of sort out. But I think a second piece of advice is there are so many really fantastic things happening once you delve into this world. Unless you're really sort of have your heart set on starting something from scratch, I would partner. I would see what's your passion. Mine happens to be women's economic empowerment. But whatever your passion is, look and see who's doing something interesting in the social business arena and throw in with them. Because it really, you have to create this whole ecosystem. And it involves people with lots of different kinds of skills and talents. And I think there's perhaps more immediate gratification by helping something grow and take it to the next level. So that's another piece of advice I would suggest.
Yeah, that's I guess when you're starting out, it just seems so daunting, but that makes a lot of sense, just to go on if there is a technology out there that's trying to get out, but you have a better idea to get it out there, and or a better market idea for that, and I've done that too. So I I think that's a great
Yeah,
advice.
you two are very similar in this way, in that you both just sort of jumped in the pool, if you will, and started swimming and maybe dog paddling to get started. But
and then thought
a few
maybe
times
that
going
wasn't
under.
So smart.
then, you'll get to the Michael Phelps level here, or the Missy Franklin level here in Colorado shortly. So, Connie, we have to run to break, but if people wanted to learn more about ARZU and the work that you're doing, where do they get more information about the fantastic work?
Well, we have websites, which is ARZU, which actually means hope in Dari. It's arzustudiohope.org, and that's all of our rugs and a big description of our social programs. But our little product, which is on the other end, this is a little $15 product and 150 new jobs for women who are not skilled in rug weaving. This is called Peace Cord, C-O-R-D, and it's made of parachute cord. And we hope these will be the new Livestrong. So peacecord.org, and we also have Facebook sites for both ARZU and Peace Cord.
Yeah, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about Peace Corps and the launch of that, and especially here in this very strong military region and state. This is something that is just a fantastic opportunity for Colorado to really engage. But like she said, it's arzustudiohope.org or peacecord.org. Don't go anywhere. We'll have more with Kelly De La Torre and Connie Duckworth when we come back.